Hi everyone, we're now going to talk about Chapter 2, which is all about sampling, samples good and bad. I wanted to first start with a statistics in the news article. Sometimes I like to start with news articles that relate to what we're going to be talking about and that better illustrate some of the ideas that we'll be focusing on. So here's an interesting headline. Let's not hug it out with our dogs. Researchers claim that hugging your dog raises its stress and anxiety levels. So a lot of you I know probably have dogs. You probably like to hug your dogs. Maybe this is a shock to you. Maybe it's not. But I want to tell you a little bit more about this study. First of all, however, I want you to think about how you would go about gathering some information if you had a theory that hugging a dog is bad for your dog. So let's say you have this theory that hugging is bad for dogs. You want to be able to prove that hugging causes the dog's stress and anxiety levels to increase. How would you go about carrying out a study in order to reach that conclusion? What do you think you would need to do? So I want you to think about that, and I want to tell you now about the study that was actually done, the study that led to this particular headline. So in this particular study, a random sample of 250 pictures of people hugging dogs was obtained from the internet and analyzed by one person who had a theory that dogs do not like to be hugged. So think about what was done here and maybe what some problems might be. It wasn't really clear how this random sample was chosen. Again, the researcher was focusing on pictures of dogs found on the internet, so he obviously didn't know these dogs. He didn't know the context in which the pictures were being taken, maybe what had happened right before the pictures were taken, or anything in the background that was not shown in the picture. The person doing the analyzing was the person who went into this feeling like hugging is bad. So he might have been looking for particular things in pictures that other people wouldn't be looking at, other people who had no idea or had no thoughts or preconceived notions about how hugging would impact a dog. So already there are some things that are maybe not quite right, that maybe could have been done a little bit better, that might lead us to question some of the end results. He used photos where the dog's face was clearly visible and no situations where one might expect the dog to be stressed by other factors. So again, would he be able to tell this based just on these photos that he was finding on the internet? That's questionable. In 81.6% of the pictures, the dog showed signs of distress. So the dog was being hugged and showed certain signs that were indicative of distress, like licking the lips or having wide eyes or raising a paw. And maybe you're trying to visualize this in your head. Let me help you a little bit here. Here's one particular picture from this study. I want you to look really carefully at this picture. Let me know if you think the dog looks upset, stressed, miserable, anxious. Here's the dog. So this little girl, she really loves her dog. Maybe that's not her dog, we're not sure. Look at the dog. I won't say any more. What about this dog? Do you think this dog is in distress? Should we save this dog? Should we rescue this dog? Do we have to have an intervention here? Okay, so the guy, he's happy, he's smiling at the dog. The dog is looking away, maybe trying to escape, we don't know. I won't say any more, but here are just a couple of pictures that were presented in the article. And again, here are some of the details to think about. Here's the big question though, is what was done an experiment? So in Chapter 1, you actually learned a little bit about what experiments are and how they differ from observational studies. Would you consider this to be an experiment? I'm hoping that you're saying no, because of the fact that really it was just one person observing pictures that he found on the internet. He had certain things he was looking for in the pictures. He wasn't setting up a controlled situation where dogs were being hugged and others were not being hugged, where maybe their stress levels were being measured before being hugged and then after being hugged. So there really was no manipulation or control on the part of the researcher. He was just observing things that were naturally occurring. So how we gather our data certainly matters, and the conclusions we can reach matter based on how the data was gathered. So again, that's something that we hope that you're going to be thinking of a lot throughout the semester, because we're going to be talking about lots and lots of studies, and we always want you to be asking questions about where is the data coming from, how was it gathered, if certain conclusions are being reached, was an experiment conducted or was it an observational study, and what kind of conclusions can we reach based on what kind of study was being conducted. So an observational study is one where we just observe individuals and measure variables of interest, but we're not trying to influence the results. We're not trying to control the situation in order to better understand if one particular thing is what is causing the result. So a survey is actually one type of experimental study where we're often just assessing people's attitudes and opinions, but ideally we're not trying to influence them in any particular way. We're just observing what they naturally think about something. We can contrast this again with an experiment. If we want to reach conclusions that one thing causes something else, we need to set up a situation where we're controlling the environment in a certain way, where we're holding certain things constant so that we know at the end of our study that it was the variable that we're interested in that's actually causing the response and not other variables that we're not being controlled for. So in an experiment, we're deliberately imposing some treatment to observe responses. And the purpose of an experiment is to reach these causal conclusions, to determine if the treatment is causing a particular change in the response. So we're going to talk about experiments in much more detail when we get into chapters 5 and 6. But right now, as you're reading through chapters 1 and 2, we just want you to have this understanding of how an experiment differs from an observational study and how each is going to impact the conclusions that we can draw. Okay, so again, going back to chapter 1, some of the things that we talked about in chapter 1, you might remember I had asked you to imagine a situation where you are gathering some information from your peers. You're in a large lecture hall, you have to gather some information from some of your peers. Some other terms that we want you to understand, we want you to understand the difference between a population and a sample, and I started to get at that toward the end of the chapter 1 lecture videos. So who do you think the population is? So the population, remember, is this bigger group that we're trying to reach a conclusion about. So the population could be all the students who are gathered in the lecture hall. So maybe just all the students who are in the online section of STAT 1350. The population could be all STAT 1350 students. The population probably wouldn't be all college students because we say right off the bat that we're focused just on STAT 1350. So when you're trying to decide who the population is, think really carefully about what the initial questions are. Who are we trying to say something about? Oftentimes, if you read really carefully that initial question and you think about what kind of information we're trying to gather and about who we're trying to gather the information, that'll help you determine who the big population is. What is the sample? So the sample is the subset of the population that you're actually able to survey or gather information from. So in your case, the sample would be those few students you talked to. Maybe you talked to 5 students, maybe you talked to 10 students. That would be your sample. It's a smaller part of the bigger group. It's a smaller subset of the population. Think about how you select your sample. So you didn't actually do this, but maybe when you were imagining it, you were thinking about how you would gather information. Some of you maybe thought about just gathering information conveniently from people who were sitting near you. Others maybe thought about running around the whole lecture hall trying to gather information from people sitting in different locations. Maybe you decide you're going to focus on one row in the lecture hall and you're going to try to talk to every 5th person in that row. So think about how you're selecting your sample, because how you select your sample is going to have an impact on what types of conclusions you can draw about the population and whether you actually can draw conclusions back to the population. So we want you to be thinking about that as we talk about different sampling methods. So a few other quick things to talk about that are coming up in chapters 1 and 2. Again, understanding this idea of the population, it's the entire group about which we want information. In statistics, oftentimes we want to know things about populations, but we don't have access to those populations, so we need to take samples to learn more about the populations. A census would be where you have conducted a survey that includes everyone in the whole population. So a census is surveying the entire population. So we say here that it's a sample survey where you're including the entire population in the sample. So if you're able to have a sample that includes the whole population, we call that a census. Now, again, a key idea, which I just talked about in the other slide, is that we're often interested in knowing something about a larger group, and we take a sample to find out that information. Oftentimes we just don't have access to the larger group, so we need to rely on taking a good sample and then trying to make an inference back to the larger group. But here's a question to think about. Why not just always take a census? Let's say that we have access to the whole population. Wouldn't we learn more if we could just take a census? Well, yes, if you have access to the whole population and you can take a census, that's great. You would want to do that if you could, but a lot of times it's just not possible. Even if you have access to the whole population, it might be costly in terms of time, in terms of resources to actually survey everyone in the population. So imagine that we only have a small amount of time. We're in a large lecture hall and I say, I want you to meet some of your classmates. I want you to take a sample of your classmates. You know, you just wouldn't have the time to survey everyone, even though everyone is right there. So even though everyone is right there in front of you, it would be very time consuming to go around and gather information from everyone. We just wouldn't have the time to do that. So a lot of times, even if we have a population right in front of us and we can access it, it might not be easy to access it. And so again, we want to try to take a sample to allow us to make that inference. So I hope that was making some sense. So just in a visual format, I wanted to show this, that we're interested in a larger group. We take a subset of that group to say something about the larger group. And the key idea is that, again, even if we have access to the whole population, taking a sample can be cheaper, it can be quicker, and it can be easier than taking a census. And it can give us valid information if we do it well. So when we come back, we're going to actually talk about many different kinds of sampling methods that we could use, from the more convenient types of methods to the random sampling methods. Okay, so we'll be right back.